Welcome to another exciting episode of Carving the Divine TV. My name is Yujiro Seki. I'm a director, writer, and the producer of the documentary Carving the Divine. Carving the Divine is about the Buddhist sculptors of Japan, and I'm ready to present it for the first time in the world. But before I do so, I thought it would be a great idea to introduce the basic concept of Buddhism and the history of Buddhism so that when you guys finally watch my documentary, you guys can watch it at the maximum value. So today, ladies and gentlemen, this is the moment that we've been waiting for. So we're going to be talking about the history of Busshi. You might ask, Yuji, but your film is about Busshi. Yes, it is about Busshi, but it's a modern day Busshi. So we focus on people who are making statues in the 21st century. So we're not going to be talking about the history of Busshi in our documentary, but it is important. Because of this history, I decided to make this documentary. And today we're going to be talking about all about that. So rather than me talking about it, I always have this person, our hero. He can talk about these statues and the bushes all day long. So I would love to introduce to you Mr. Mark Schumacher. Welcome to our show.
Hello, my wife says I can talk all day long about other things too.
Wonderful. So yes, by now we should know everything about you, but just in case for the people who don't know anything about you, please introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm an independent, self-taught scholar, art historian, appraiser of Japanese Buddhist statuary. Next year, it will be 3 decades that I've been living in Kamakura, which is the 13th century capital of Japan, and also the home of what the Japanese art historians claim to be the most brilliant pinnacle of Buddhist statuary. And so I'm very lucky I can see the statues in person at the temples, at the shrines. And my enthusiasm just continues to grow. Finally, that I have put this together 30 years of effort on a webpage called the A to Z Photo Dictionary of Japanese Buddhist Statuary, and we'll show the link to that page at the end of the presentation.
Wonderful. So let's just dive into it. So,
okay,
Mr. Schumacher, so what is Busshi, and please tell us the history of Busshi.
Okay, I'm going to switch to the slideshow. The Busshi simply means a master carver of Buddhist statuary. And before we start and jump into it, we must remember that Buddhism did not come to Japan until around 550 of the Common Era. And there were no Busshi, there were no Buddhist masters of carving statues in this country until sometime around the 6th century and the 7th century. Now, before we go, we're going to just quickly review the other presentations we've given, talking about the deities, the Buddhist deities. At the very, very top are the Buddhas, and then below the Buddhas are the Bodhisattvas. Below the Bodhisattvas are the wrathful kings of light, the mantra kings. Below them are the devas, the Tenbu, who were imported from the Hindu pantheon into the Buddhist pantheon. And then today, we're going to be talking about this 5th level down here, the Busshi, the master carvers, and monks. Often monks themselves were Busshi. Now, just very quickly, around 610, 620, we have our first well-known Busshi. And it's important to remember that Japan was just having contact with China and Korea. Japan itself did not know how to carve. It did not have metal workers. It did not have jewelry makers. It did not have serious architect. And so in the very beginning of Japan's introduction of Buddhism, nearly all the statues and all the temples were made by Korean immigrants and Chinese immigrants. And the Japanese, about 100 years, it took them about 100 years before the Japanese mastered these skills. So the very first Busshi, the very first master carvers in Japan were not Japanese. They were Koreans or Chinese. And many of them were people who had lived here in Japan for decades. They were already naturalized Japanese. But that's an important thing to remember. So we had the categories of the Buddhist deities. And the other presentations we gave, we told you how you could quickly and easily identify what kind of statue it is, the Buddhas with the simple gowns and the curly hair, the Bodhisattva with the princely clothes, the wrathful Myo-o with a fire halo and the swords and weapons, and the Tenbu, the Hindu deities. Today, we're talking now about the Busshi and the monks, which is this section here. Last but not least, before we get going, the world of Buddhist statuary and Buddhist philosophy actually includes 10 different levels. And at the very top, as we said, the Buddhas, then the Bodhisattvas, and then the Devas, and then the human realm. And you can see in this particular diagram, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving, but the human realm is over here. And this is where our Busshi and our monks would be located. They are not in the enlightened realm yet, they're still in the human realm. But that just gives you a kind of idea of the taxonomy and the levels of the Buddhist cosmos. That helps when you want to identify the statues. Is that a Buddha? Is that a Bodhisattva? Is that a Myo-o? Oh, that's a monk. Okay, so that's just a little introduction. Today, we're going to have a whirlwind tour through 600 years of statue making in Japan. We have to remember now, if you look at the very bottom of this screen down here by the yellow bar, you'll see that up until the 600 AD or so, there was no Buddhist statuary in Japan. There was no Buddhism in Japan. Buddhism was not introduced here until about 550. And it wasn't until around 620, 630, 40 that the Japanese started building temples and started making statues, again, under the direction of Koreans and Chinese who came at that time or who already lived here. So we're going to start at the earliest point in the Asuka period, which is around 640, 650. The main form, the mainstay form of Buddhist statuary in the early years, we call them the ancient times, were metal statues made of bronze. And they were often very skinny with very long faces and skinny bodies and very geometrical robes. And very small as well. And so there are hundreds and hundreds of these statues still survive into modern times. Back in the very earliest of days, over here on the very left side of the screen, these are statues of Miroku, the Bodhisattva and Buddha of the future. There are hundreds and hundreds of these statues still surviving into modern days. And nearly all Japanese, even today, even my Japanese wife who doesn't have an interest in Buddhist statuary, even she knows Miroku Bosatsu. That because it was one of the first types of statues brought to Japan, it was popularized and perpetuated so that even today, even the younger people will still recognize these statues of the Miroku Bodhisattva. Now we finally get to our first Busshi. And this guy's name was Tori Busshi. there's a lot of confusion. Was he Chinese or was he Korean? There doesn't seem to be any agreement. But we do know that this man, Tori, made these statues you see on this page because his name is inscribed in the back of the bronze, Tori Busshi. That's the first time we actually see the term Busshi written down as well. And that was 623. And Busshi then would mean master carver of the statue. And let me see. He then had a workshop of people who made statues very much like he did. Look at these statues, very skinny, very elongated faces, geometrical robe formations, all made in bronze. And we go back again, you can see the similarities of this. This is called the Tori style, because it's based on the work of this Busshi named Tori Busshi. Again, the Japanese were first learning how to work with metal and bronze, first learning architecture, working with jewelry, working with wood. So, and we have to thank the Koreans and the Chinese. Here again, we're seeing more work of the Tori school. And here we see over here on the left, the Guze Kanon. This is one of the most famous, oldest statues, wooden statues in all of the country. Some people say it was made by the Tori school of sculptors because again, the slender, skinny face, the slender, skinny body. And also, I forgot to mention, these statues from these early years were all about the front view. There was no attention paid to the side or no attention paid to the back. So the statues aren't in the round. They're generally speaking, they're just flat in the back. There's no details on the back or the sides. So in this case, over here, the Guze Kanon, some people say this is a statue in the likeness of Shotoku Taishi, one of the very first princes in the Japanese in history, about 610, 620. He's the guy who ordered the construction of temples. The very first temple was Horyuji. And guess what? This statue is located at Horyuji. This statue as well is at Horyuji. In the likeness, some say, of Shotoku Taishi. Curiously, this was a hidden statue, and it was not unveiled to the public until around 1890, 1895 or so. It was unveiled. And curiously enough, here on the back side of this Guze Kanon, here on the back side, it's just a nail pounded into the halo, into the head of the statue. Some people say it's a voodoo type of situation. They say Shotoku Taishi was assassinated and killed, and that this statue was made in his likeness as a kind of like a voodoo statue to keep his spirit down so that he couldn't rise up in anger. There's still a lot of unknown stories about this statue, but again, Tori style, slender faces, slender bodies, no attention to the back or to the sides. Up here, also, this is the oldest clay statue from the Yasuka period. And also, again, the art scholars, modern art scholars, generally agree that it came from the Tori school. Tori would have had his own apprentices, his own assistant Busshi. And that, again, they think this came from the Tori school. Again, the slender body, the slender faces. Just down here in the little bottom here, I threw a rooftop of a temple just to mention again that the Koreans brought a lot of the techniques for casting in metal, for carving in wood, and for temple construction itself. And Horyuji, the oldest temple where these statues that we've seen are located, was built by a Korean family called the Kongo family. And this family is still in business today. So we're talking about a family-run construction company building temples that's been around for 1,500 years. And it was recently bought out by a big Japanese conglomerate, but they still maintain their independence. But again, I just wanted to say that the Koreans helped the Japanese immensely in terms of bringing the metal casting, wood cutting, and architectural techniques to Japan. And we're still in the 600s. Again, you can see that we have the same skinny type of face. We have the very skinny types of bodies. And here, however, we have a different Bushi. This guy's name is Yamaguchi no Oguchi Atai. And we know about him because he appears in various documents of the time. And we know that he made this statue here of one of the four heavenly kings, because his name is carved in the back of the halo, and it's called Yamaguchi Bushi. So the people were using this as a term to mean master carver of wood or metal statues. This other one here, Kudara, the Kudara Kanon, is also a very, very famous statue from the 7th century, middle of the 7th century. Again, slender face, slender body. But we're not sure if it was carved in Japan or if it was brought from Korea. The metal crown on the head indicates that it actually came from Korea or was modeled after Korean statues, because of this particular crown with the honeysuckle lotus pattern is the same type of pattern we find in the tombs of Korean kings. So we definitely know it is influenced greatly by Korea. So again, here we just saw back here on the last slide the one of the four heavenly kings made by Yamaguchi Bushi. On the next slide, we have four statues. Yamaguchi's statue is one of those. I would say that Yamaguchi probably should be credited with all four of these statues, because he would have had a team of people working under him. The fact that only his one name appears on one statue doesn't mean that the other three were made by, it doesn't mean they were made by him, but they would have been made under his instruction and under his supervision. And again, we can see a very interesting slenderness to the objects. But again, I mean, I find these statues to be very powerful. Just their primitive innocence, to me, is startlingly beautiful. So Yamaguchi, we saw here. Here we saw Tori, Mr. Tori Bushi, now Yamaguchi Bushi. And now we're jumping to the Nara period. Nara period is from like the 8th century, all of the 8th century. By this time, bronze is still the main material for making statues, bronze and metal. But now the Japanese want to make bigger and bigger statues. They don't want the tiny little metal statues that we saw earlier. In this period, in the Nara period, the emperor and the empresses order the nationwide construction of temples in all the provinces, and they order the construction of a gigantic bronze Buddha in Nara at Todaiji. And this period of time, the eighth century, the 700s, is called the classical period of Japanese statuary. We can still see a great influence from Korea and a great influence from China, but now the Japanese are adding their own sensibilities to the statuary, because now they've been trained for over 100 years by the Koreans, and the Chinese have been trained. And so now we start to find Japanese Busshi appearing among the artisans of the age. We'll notice also that over here, there's a fondness for plumpness, not just skinny, but plump. You see the faces are also very plump. Again, metal is the mainstay, but there is a great experimentation with clay statues, great experimentation with dry lacquer statues, stone statues, and wood. But again, wood is still only a minor art form. Nara, 800s. Now, the giant Buddha of Nara, the Daibutsu, the Todaiji Daibutsu, was made by a Japanese man by the name of Kuninaka no Kimimaru. And he was also the guy who supervised the construction of Todaiji Temple and supervised the construction and the creation of statues, hundreds of statues that would go to the provincial temples, that would go to the Nara temples, or go to the temples around the country. The great Buddha of Nara, here we see at the very top over here. This statue has been destroyed, essentially melted twice over the years. It was melted in the civil wars in 1180, and then it was melted again in the civil wars around the 1600. And so much of if you go to Nara today and see the big Buddha in Nara, it's not the original. Most of the pieces that are original are still part of the base, the lotus pedestal, but the head, the hands, the body are not the original anymore. Here you can see at the bottom, I just threw it in because that's fun. You can see modern day, the people at the temple are cleaning and dusting off the head of the big Buddha, right? He's down here, they're using ropes to dust and clean the big Buddha. Now, this gentleman, Kuninaka Busshi, is also considered to be the artist who made this statue of Fuku Kenjaku Kannon, the never empty lasso Kannon Bosatsu. And I just throw it in there to show you that just because he was supervising the construction of a big temple and a giant statue doesn't mean he wasn't busy supervising the construction of other statues for other temples. And so that's why we don't know for sure if he is the guy who made these, but we're pretty sure that it came from his workshop or from his pupils. Again, there's not a lot of written records, so it's very hard to say made by this person, made by that person. But if we know the style and we know the location of the workshop, and if the statues are in those temples, then we can make a pretty good guess as to who made or who supervised the construction. Again, here's more statues that are attributed to Kuninaka. And these are the four heavenly kings. Now you can see something interesting here is that these statues look more realistic. They're not skinny or plump. They're martial. And they have very interesting facial gestures. We don't know for sure that these were made by Kuninaka, but we're pretty sure that they were made under his supervision. And these are made of clay, by the way. So here we've seen the one made of bronze, one made of wood, and the 4 made of clay, all attributed to the Kuninaka Busshi, or his workshop. Oh, by the way, I forgot maybe that along with the empress and the emperor ordering the construction of temples all throughout the country, the emperor and empresses at that time also established workshops, government-sponsored workshops where all the statuary was made. And these statues were made at Todaiji, which was the center of Buddhism in Nara at the time. From Nara, the classical period, we move into the Heian period. Now, the Heian period is a very, very interesting period in time when we see the emergence of a semi-independent Japanese style of statuary, no longer concerned with the models from Korea, no longer concerned with the models from China. But in the very beginning of the Heian period, the 9th century, this is the time when Saicho and Kukai and a number of Japanese monks traveled to China and brought back the esoteric traditions, the Mikkyo traditions. And this is, as we talked about in the last episode, the Tenbu episode, this is when the Hindu deities were introduced to the Japanese pantheon. The Hindu deities were converted to Buddhism and became protectors of Buddhism. So now in the first 2 centuries of the Heian period, with the introduction of the Hindu deities, the Tenbu introduction, we see the construction and the creation of all of the Fudo Myo of multiple-headed, multiple-armed, fierce, wrathful deities. And that's the first half. The second half of the Heian period is a complete reversal where we go to refined, elegant, and a wonderful new sense of humanistic sensibility. So the first half, the Hindu deities, wrathful, monster-like. The second half, refined, elegant, aristocratic. Here are just some of the earliest statues you can see from the Heian period. Over here we have Brahma, a Bunten over here in the corner. Here are our multi-headed, multi-armed Myo-o. Whoops, getting ahead of myself. In the middle there's a statue of Bishamon Ten. He's one of the 4 heavenly kings, but he's also considered the leader of the 4 heavenly kings, and he is the only diva, one of the only diva to have his own independent cult. Now I put those two, the Bishamon there, next to this lovely, here's the Bishamon, next to this lovely statue of the historical Buddha. Both of these statues were brought to Japan from China. And but both of them served as models for the next 2 centuries into carving Bishamon and to carving the Shaka, the historical Buddha. And there are still, as we saw from the Asuka period, we saw Miroku was very popular. These 2 forms of Bishamon Ten and the historical Buddha also became popularized, and hundreds and hundreds, and we should say thousands and thousands of them were made and spread across the country. And so you can still find these particular models in abundance. And you can still find modern day Busshi who copy this particular style. Over here, we see more of here we still see a plumpness. It's not really proportional, but here we see these are the deities that are very important to the esoteric school. Here we see Kokuzo Bosatsu, and here we see Kokuzo Bosatsu down here as well. And last but not least, during this early part of the Heian period, we had the introduction of the mandala art form. So now, instead of just dry lacquer statues, clay statues, stone statues, and wood statues, we have painting goes berserk. We have mandalas. Mandala paintings are a new vehicle of creativity, and in which all of these Hindu deities are featured. Then we move to the middle of the Heian period. And here we can see again, there's still a preference for plumpness, fatness, round faces. And there's still not much of a attention paid to the backside of the statues. But yet here we can see a richness with this gold gilding, the gold foil used. These techniques were perfected by the Japanese over time. And in many cases, these statues were also painted in bright colors. Most of that paint has worn off on most of the statues. So today we only see the natural wood. I actually prefer the natural wood to the painted, but just try to imagine a statue like this being painted with bright reds and oranges and greens. Now we know that this particular statue of the medicine Buddha, Yakushi Buddha, is attributed to the head Busshi and also a high priest at Toji Temple in Kyoto. His name was Erisozu. And here's a case where the head Busshi, the master Busshi of the workshops, was called the Daibushi. And then under him, he had apprentice Busshi, and they were called Shobushi. And so here's a statue made by a Daibushi of this period. We want to recall as well that ultimately over time, these ranks of giving ranks to the Busshi. If you were a master sculptor at one of the major temples, sometimes you were given a rank equal to the aristocracy. You were given a rank given to monks, but even though you weren't a monk, you were given a real high social rank. So here again, we see some examples of a workshop which was controlled by a guy named Eri Sozu. Now we move into the most interesting period in the middle of the Heian period and the emergence of a gentleman named Jocho Bushi. And Jocho Bushi is considered the father of the refined, humanistic, realistic, elegant statuary, Buddhist statuary that Japan is known for today. He was the father. And from his loins, from his blood, and from his workshop sprang the three most important schools of Japanese Buddhist statuary, according to the Japanese themselves. Here, sadly, Jocho, as you can see in the chart here, here's Jocho up here at the very top, and then the solid line means bloodline, and the dotted line means apprentices at his workshop. Jocho's work, sadly, was lost. Nearly all of the work he himself made is lost. This is the only statue, this giant statue of Amida Buddha at the Byodo-in, is the only statue we know of that is still extant from Jocho. However, Jocho was asked to make this statue for the Byodo-in. He was also asked to supervise all the statuary that was made at the Byodo-in. And now down here at the bottom of the screen, you can see all these lovely angelic bosatsu on clouds, they're called, bosatsu on clouds. And even though Jocho didn't make them himself, we can say with lots of confidence that he supervised the construction of these. You can see in the photo above, you can see the little angelic statues are hung on the walls surrounding the Amida Buddha. So this type of charming, refined Buddhist statuary was called Wa-yo. Wa meaning Japan, and yo meaning style. The Wa-yo means it's the Japanese style. So Jocho is credited with the first independent Japanese style of Buddhist statuary. Um, that we say, forget the Korean influence, forget the Chinese influence. Now we're talking Japan and Japan sensibilities. So from Jocho, we got three major schools of Buddhist statuary. So Jocho, middle of the Heian, in the late Heian, here are two schools that sprang from Jocho's workshop and from his own bloodline. Now notice down at the bottom here where the photos are. Now there's a loveliness and a refinement now to these statues, and a proportionality. We're not talking about plump bodies and plump faces. We're talking nicely proportioned statues, realistic statues of, well, not all of them, but mostly we're seeing a real development that is turning towards realism and humanism in the statuary. And just again, it's just very fun to just see this in a slideshow and to see how it developed. Now we're in the late Heian period. We went through the introduction of the wrathful esoteric deities, multiple headed, multiple armed, then to the middle of the Heian period with the emergence of Jocho, refinement, elegance. Then to the late Heian, where from his workshop sprang two schools of statuary. And now the third school of statuary that sprang from Jocho's workshop in the late Heian came from Koke, Busshi. Now Koke carved all of these statues. Now look at the realism and humanism. The faces themselves are really quite human. These are faces of the six patriarchs of the Hosho sect of Buddhism. Down here at the bottom, I have three different views of the same statue, of the Fukukenjaku Kanon. But again, look at the richness, the proportionality, and the elegance of these statues, and the humanism of the statues of the monks. Now, from Koke, his blood, we then usher in the beginning of the Kamakura period. And interestingly enough, Unkei did carve statues for the Kamakura military samurai classes, but most of the statues that are still surviving of Unkei are not in Kamakura. In fact, Kamakura itself, where I live, we have only one national treasure in all of Kamakura City, and that's the big Buddha of Kamakura, which was made in 1252. Many of the temples here in Kamakura say their statues were made by Unkei, because then they could, get people to come to the temple. But the fact that none of the statues that are attributed to Unkei at the temples in Kamakura, we know is a bit of a fib, a lie. If they were made by Unkei, they would be national treasures, but they're not. These are national treasures. We see actually a carved statue of Unkei up here. Unkei was awarded all the top ranks in his lifetime. He achieved the highest status one could achieve in the carving of statuary, and he is mostly noted for realism. That is the main attribute that Japan's modern day scholars will tell you about Unkei and the Kamakura era statuary is realism and humanism. Everything is proportional, humanistic. And here, look at these statues here of these two monks from India. You could almost be talking with them. Here is the earliest statue we know that Unke made when he was a young man. And here is another statue of Dainichi that he made later in his lifetime. Here's a statue of Bishamonten that he made. Here's a statue of Miroku that he's made. Here's a statue of Fudo Myo. Well, we're just seeing the face. From Unke, who is considered probably the most famous, the most acclaimed sculptor, Buddhist sculptor in all of Japan. He had 6 sons, and his 6 sons also went on to become very, very well-known Busshi. Here's some more pieces by Unke. Again, I just like to show his faces are just superb. Another new development during this period of time, especially late Heian period and then into the Kamakura period, was the Yoseki Zukuri method. In the earlier times, in the Asuka period and the Nara period and the first half of the Heian period, wood statuary is mostly carved from one piece of wood. But by the time we got to the late Heian, a method was perfected called the joined block assembly, where you use different pieces of wood. Somebody would work on the head, somebody would work on the torso, somebody else would work on the arms, somebody else would work on the base, somebody else would work on the halo, and that you could mass produce statues in workshops. So I forgot to mention that back here in Jocho's time, he was asked to make the statuary for the Byodoin. He had it all written down before they even made it. He knew exactly the proportions of the arms. He had proportions from the chin to the forehead, the proportion of the shoulder to the elbow, elbow to the hand. And so that without being there himself, he could instruct his apprentices exactly what proportions to use to make the statues. So that was like one of the new developments. And so by the time we get here to Unke's period of time, everybody's using this joined block assembly method. The wood is hollow, and then the pieces are, after they're made by the different teams, then they're assembled into one piece. Since they're hollow, a lot of dedicatory objects could go inside of the statues. So let's say you were somebody whose wife had died and you had a statue made for your wife. And then inside of it, you would say, you would have prayers for your wife. You would have wish granting jewels or other relics placed inside. Often there would be a list of the people who made the statue placed inside. And oftentimes many other objects like smaller statues would be put inside. And from x-rays today, we can determine whether or not these statues have objects inside. But a lot of the temples are unwilling to allow their statues to be opened and the inner objects taken out and researched, examined. But if we could do something of that nature, we'd probably know a lot more about who made what, if we could pull that out of all the statues in these hollow joined block statues. Now from Unke, again, the most acclaimed of all of the sculptures in Japan's long history, here we have statues made by his sons and by his apprentices. Again, you can see a total transformation towards realism, towards humanistic proportions, towards detail in our graceful artistry. And from the same workshop that Unke came from, he had another Busshi. This Busshi was named Kaike. Kaike is probably as famous as Unke. The two were not brothers, but they both studied under the same master Busshi. Unke was from that bloodline. Kaike was not from that bloodline. Kaike himself became nearly or the same or more famous than Unke. And here we can just see some pieces that he's made over his lifetime. Here's a painted statue of Jizo Bosatsu. I love this. Amida Nyorai, look at these robes. Look, I just find this to be so artfully, I find it to heartwarming. The robes themselves, I just want to like jump in and float with the water. Kaike too, here are some more statues by Kaike. Again, almost all of these statues were hollow wood joined block techniques. Oftentimes, gilt gold was put on or they were painted, and they often had a metal, very, very intricate metalwork, crowns, necklaces, bracelets. From Kaike himself, Kaike had his own workshop, and here we're looking at Kaike's apprentices. Just before we looked at Unke's sons, and now we're looking at Kaike's apprentices. And again, we see this same general perfection of a humanistic form, proportionality, realism, and eloquence. And so this, to most people, is the ultimate pinnacle of Japanese Buddhist statuary in Japan. This is, according to Japan's own art scholars and art historians, the pinnacle of Japanese statuary was achieved here in the Kamakura period. Now, these different schools, we talked about Jocho had the Empa school, the Empa and the Impa and the Keiha, the three schools that we just looked at. All three of these schools got together and collaborated on the making of the statues, the thousand armed statues of Kannon Bosatsu at the Sanjusan Gendo in Kyoto, which can still be viewed today. It's a wondrous, eye-opening experience. I recommend anybody with an interest in Buddhism to visit the Sanjusan Gendo, just 3-minute walk from Kyoto Eki train station. Here we can see that all of them joined together to make these statues. So they weren't enemies, and they often collaborated. But again, we know that they all sprang from the same workshop of Jocho. So they were all coming from the same master lineage. And their style of Buddhist statuary is now considered the ultimate in Japanese Buddhist statuary. Here, the thousand-armed Kannon statues here. Here's a modern picture. They're showing a statue has been repaired, and these monks are trying to put it back in place. Here we see the faces and the bodies of two very famous Neo statues at the Sanjusan Gendo, the open mouth, Agyo, and the closed mouth, Ungyo, A meaning birth and Un meaning death. They represent all polarity, up, down, black, white, male, female, birth, death. And here at the very far end of the slide are two giant statues of the Neo that are made by Unke and Kaike. And these are, they stand guard outside the gate at Todaiji Temple in Nara. So I think we don't really need to. This slideshow will be made available freely. And if you're interested in reading about my attitude towards Asuka period, Nara period, Heian period, Kamakura statuary, you can go through this slide. Just very quickly, we now come to the Muromachi era, which follows the Kamakura period. Now we're now in the 15th and 16th centuries. This generally is considered the dark age of statuary. Not because the artists were bad. The artists did make some very lovely pieces, which are still surviving until modern times. But ultimately what happened is mass production of statuary became the norm. And a lot of the statues could be mass produced. And also what happened is there was constant civil war among the clans, and the imperial court lost more and more, had lost its power to the samurai. And so the imperial court was no longer patronizing the workshops and the Busshi. And the incessant warfare meant that the noble classes, the aristocracy, was no longer spending money on having statues made. There was a growing importance of other art forms, secular art. The Zen school, which came to prominence during the Muromachi period, also it was into painting, into calligraphy, and into the tea ceremony, and they only basically worship the historical Buddha. So there was no urge to make Buddhist statuary, or there was less patronage. And there was constant civil war, and lots of statuary was lost during this period. So it's normally called the Dark Ages of statuary in Japan. Then in the Edo period, which we're coming up real fast now to the modern days, from the 17th century, the 1700s, 1800s, there were two minor revivals in statuary. They were linked to two wandering monks, one called Enku and one called Mokujiki. And these two would carve the statues from one solid piece of wood again, just like it was done back in the early days. They would carve them from one solid piece of wood, and they would carve them quickly, and they would leave chisel marks on them to make it look as though they were unfinished. Now these pieces, there are hundreds of these pieces still surviving into modern times, but these became very, very beloved and very popular, and this style of statuary, natabori is called, is still very popular even today in the country. But again, now by this time, we must remember too that we have the printing press, and we have woodblock prints, and we have the introduction of Western technologies and art forms and industry and mass production. And so Buddhism itself has lost much of its power. In the Muromachi period, many of the great temples, the Hiei-zan, Enrakuji, the main temple of Jodo, Pure Land, all of them were destroyed. And the temples lost their powerful positions in the court, and they also lost their land. So that they used to be huge landowners. So now the temples themselves are actually quite poor. And that's another reason for the decline in the making of Buddhist statuary and the repair of temples. Here I just jumped very quickly to the modern time. You can explore these on your own, download the file and explore the links. here at the very top, we say Busshi Saito, which is the documentary film by Yujiro-san, Carving the Divine, features the workshop of this Busshi. And I've listed a number of other Busshi below that you can go and explore. And there's one Busshi I might like to mention, Nishimura Kocho. Now, Nishimura is no longer living, but Nishimura had a couple of really interesting ideas. He originally made statues for blind people, and he called them Furiai. He made the statue of the goddess of mercy, Furiai Kanon. And his main goal was to have a statue where blind people could come up and touch the statue and rub the statue and see the statue with their hands. This idea became so popular that now many temples across the country have their own versions. They have a Furiai Jizo or a Furiai Kanon where anybody can come up and touch the statues. He also had workshops at his temple in Kyoto where he allowed people to come and he would show them how to carve in stone. And nearly all the statues that were carved by the lay people at that temple are still in the courtyard, in the garden of that temple, which is well worth a visit for anybody interested in living Buddhism and the passing on of the techniques of carving. What we didn't do I've done 5 presentations now with Yujiro-san. Thank you very much. We've covered everything from the Buddha class, the Bodhisattva class, Myo-O class, Tenbu class, and now we've covered the Busshi, the makers of the statues. We didn't have a chance to talk about the mystical and magical creatures and monsters of Buddhism. And these appear prominently in the artwork as well. And that's, well, maybe something we could do in the future. But that's just another category that we didn't touch on. Just a quick place for people who want English resources and some Japanese resources to go to do some study on your own, do your own digging, so to speak. And that concludes the slideshow, and Yuichiro will post a link to this presentation so you can download it and review it at your own leisure. And then that's it. Yeah.
And we can always go to your website for more information, right?
Right. The A to Z photo dictionary there is freely available. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Wow, that was like epic. And all the years of your studying and research, you are gracious enough to share it in this short period of time. I truly appreciate it.
Well, it's maybe too much to handle in one sitting. I'm sorry I had to race through. I wanted to make it as short as possible. But there's plenty of information there to explore on your own. Essentially, what that slideshow is probably a 4-month college freshman class in Japanese art history. A teacher could then assign writings, for the Asuka period, the Heian period, and so on. But so essentially, you've got 4 months of college education in an hour.
I don't even know how to appreciate you, really.
I enjoy spreading the word.
Wonderful, wonderful. So you guys, if you think this information is useful, make sure to subscribe my YouTube channel, follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and like me on my Facebook. That's how we do it in the 21st century. So thank you so much, Mr. Schumacher, for coming here and talk to us about the history of Busshi. And again, Mr. Schumacher is so gracious enough to let you guys download this whole slideshow, the presentation, which he said 6 months of college course. Incredible. Who else can do that? So thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.